Hi, it's great to have you join us today at Croydon Hills Baptist Church online. It's fantastic that we're able to share again. And I want to say a special thanks to Tom Kimber, who's been sharing with us for the last couple of services that we've had. If you want to listen to those services, maybe you missed them over the last couple of weeks, you can go onto YouTube and search for Croydon Hills Baptist Church and you'll see them up there. And you can watch those services and listen to Tom. He shared wonderfully about what it's like in the wilderness and a great and relevant message. But we're going to continue as we kind of reflect back and continue our stories through the Gospel of Mark. When we left Mark, we left him in chapter 5, where there was a number of healings that Jesus had done and the way in which faith was central to those and making a difference in people's lives. In chapter 6, we pick up, in fact, that what Jesus had done is he'd moved from the Galilean region and gone back to Nazareth, his hometown. Maybe he wanted some refreshment, but it really wasn't like that. In fact, there was a whole lot of rejection. And as I read the text, I get this sense of almost like the discouragement and weariness. The people's demands continued on Jesus. And so there comes a point in time in chapter 6, in the middle of it, in verse 31, where he says to his closest followers, his 12 disciples, "Let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest for a while." But Jesus' popularity is out there. The crowds are still chasing him. And as they get in the boat and they travel across to the other side, the crowds almost jump in front of him. I mean, who would blame Jesus for at this point in time for wanting to get away for a little bit of me time? You know what it's like to feel drained, to feel like everybody's kind of asking for a piece of you, you know, whether it's you've had a busy day at work, or there's a laundry list of jobs around the house, or maybe you've been at school and the pressure's there and you've had exams or SACs or whatever it might be, and you sense that you're just drained and you want to be alone. And when people come and kind of hassle you at that time, our response is often one of, "Oh, look, give me some space. Leave me alone." At best, we kind of put up with the interruption, don't we? But here we read about how when Jesus gets off the boat, he sees the crowds and he's moved with compassion. He sees the people because they're like sheep without a shepherd. And he's filled with this empathy. It's the same type of empathy that's referred to in the Good Samaritan. He's filled with empathy for the people. Without that empathy, without compassion, Jesus could simply have withdrawn. But instead, he sees them. That's a really deep expression, isn't it? He sees them not just with his physical eyes, but he sees them in a sense with his mind. He discerns the state of their heart. You see, seeing people is vital to compassion, isn't it? Jesus says, as Mark reports it in his gospel, that they were like sheep without a shepherd. Sheep without a shepherd might conjure a picture of Jesus kind of gently sort of soothing them, but that's not really what the Jewish imagery of sheep and shepherds was. Shepherds were people who were more like, in the history of Israel, like a figure like Moses, a military leader who would muster the forces of Israel and lead them in a certain direction, whether it was war or conquering or whatever it might have been. And so Jesus sees this crowd of people. They're lost. They're seeming to have no direction or purpose in life. And now we read that Jesus takes this opportunity as he's moved with compassion to teach them. I always wonder when I read that, what did he teach them about? There's no kind of detail in it. Mark doesn't specify what the content of it is. I assume, in some ways a kind of informed assumption, that Jesus is speaking to their lostness, trying to give them some hope and some purpose in life. You know, many people in our world know what it's like to feel lost, don't we? To feel like life is without some sense of purpose or direction. Normally we're told that to find that direction we need to search within ourselves. Look to ourselves to find our inner purpose, our inner mission in life. I think that Jesus points them in a different direction. We don't see it in the content of his teaching, but we see it in the content of his actions. Because Jesus speaks loudly through what he does. The crowd must have been enthralled listening to Jesus. This was no sitcom-length talk. They weren't distracted by their watches or their stomachs, and before they know it, it's late in the day, and the disciples are off to the side there, and they're kind of winding Jesus up, time to finish, kind of like at the Oscars where they start playing music to get them off the stage, the winners. And the disciples are saying, it's getting late in the day, we need to go and get some food. You and I know what that's like when you've got people around your house and they stay longer than expected and you don't really have the food that you're expecting and you start raiding your pantry. Well, there's no pantry to raid here. And the disciples act as almost like straight men in a comedy skit. They're the ones who are setups for what Jesus is going to do for the main punchline. Here they are in this deserted place, no money. What will we do? Jesus is filled with compassion for the crowd, but it seems like the disciples are distinctly lacking in compassion. Instead, Jesus flips it on its head and he says to the disciples, feed them. With what? It's a perfectly logical question that the disciples respond, isn't it? They should be making practical plans. They should be going home. We don't have enough money. We don't have access to food. It's impossible. Here we are out in the middle of nowhere. It's impossible for us to feed them. But as we read before in Mark chapter 6, it describes it so simply. Find what you can. Get them to sit down and feed them. And the disciples search around the crowd and they bring back a small gift. 5 loaves, a couple of small fish. How will that be enough for 5,000 men? Probably in reality 12 to 15,000 people. But Jesus is able to multiply the smallest of gifts. And the story describes how Jesus gives thanks to God. And all in this miraculous feeding have enough to eat and more that there's leftovers. Now, do you struggle with the miraculous? Scholars have tried to rationalise this event over the years. Some people have said, well, Jesus had a secret stash of food hidden in the desert somewhere that he was able to bring out. Or others have said, well, there was a whole bunch of rich ladies who went and got food and brought it to them. Or maybe that Jesus and his disciples, well, they set an example for everybody. And so everybody else started to bring out the food that they have and share it around. Or others have supposed that, well, what they were sharing was kind of like a communion meal. Kind of a micro, little small meal, little small morsels which they were able to share amongst themselves. The disciples don't attempt to rationalise those events. They're not fooled by some explanation of trying to rationalise it away. No, they see the miracle, but they can't believe it. In verse 42, Mark 6 verse 42, it says, they all ate as much as they wanted. And afterwards the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftover bread and fish. A total of 5,000 men and their families were fed. The disciples participated and saw this miracle that Jesus performed. Who is this man, again they ask? Who is Jesus? The one who heals lepers, the one who heals the crippled man, revives a young girl, exorcises evil from demon-possessed people, forgives sin and calms the storm. Who is this man? They're not trying to rationalise it away. They are seeing Jesus for who he is and what he does. And as much as Mark sums it up so succinctly, there's a lot going on beyond the surface, these deeper meanings that are speaking to the disciples and to the crowd. You see, these miracles speak very clearly, particularly to the Jewish people in that crowd. The most significant event in Jewish history, an event that's remembered by the largest annual day, is the Jewish exodus from Egypt and slavery. The Passover event is central to who they are. And the Passover event leads to life in the desert. Life in the desert where the people of Israel are fed by God. And here in Mark chapter 6, we see people in the middle of nowhere, fed by Jesus. This is an illusion that Jesus, in fact, has some parallel with Moses. And in fact, if you read the very next section, from verse 44 onwards to about verse 50, it describes how Jesus is walking across the water. So here we have these two events, walking on water and feeding 5,000, these events which bring to mind these Old Testament landmarks of God feeding the people of Israel in the desert and crossing the Red Sea and the Jordan. Here it's saying that Jesus has some connection with Moses, but in fact Jesus is greater than Moses. He is leading a new exodus to a new life, something which is greater than not just food which can feed you for the day, but food which has an abundance and more. There's 12 baskets of leftovers. It reflects in Moses how Moses called out to God asking for a leader. You can read in Numbers 27, it says that Moses said to the Lord, "May the Lord, the God of the spirits of all mankind, appoint a man over this community to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in, so that the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd." It's identical language. You see, what this is saying is this, is that Jesus is the good shepherd. Jesus is the one who gives life and purpose and meaning. Jesus is able to feed people in a way that others can't. Where the crowd was lost and without purpose and meaning, Jesus provides that. Jesus is the place where people encounter God. It's the place where stomachs are filled, not just physically but also spiritually. See, Jesus exercises God's power and uses it for the good of his flock. He is the one who provides the necessities not only of a physical life, but also of a spiritual life. Who is this man? The feeding of this great crowd reveals Jesus as the one who gives purpose and satisfies. That's who Jesus is. Not just food for our body, but food for our soul. He's the one who gives a banquet feast. More than you can imagine, more than you can eat, fills you to the top, and there's leftovers to have. You see, that's the description of a life that follows him. A life that truly satisfies. You know, earlier in chapter 6 of the Gospel of Mark, it details a party that was being held in the king's palace. It was a party which all the right people were invited. The highest government officials, the finest food and wine was served. But Herod's feast, Herod the king, with its exotic fanfare and dancing girls, ultimately cannot satisfy human hunger. In fact, at that feast, all that is served up is death. But at this feast in the wilderness, life is served, because life comes from Jesus. And when Jesus asks his disciples to feed the crowd, they are confused because there's no supermarket, no KFC, no Golden Arches. No, Jesus himself provides the food. And Jesus is the one who in himself gives that purpose and direction. And Jesus is the one who makes the difference between sheep that are lost without a shepherd to sheep that now have purpose because they have a shepherd. And for us as humans, we know that so often we attempt to satisfy the hunger that's within our soul in so many futile ways. We try to satisfy it with toys. We try to satisfy it with activity. We try to satisfy it with relationships. We try to satisfy it by searching within ourselves for hope. But instead we miss the point that the purpose for life is found in Jesus. That he is the one who feeds our soul. He is the one who gives food to the hungry. And I want to say that to you today. That if you have this sense of a hunger within your soul, that you can find food in Jesus that ultimately fills and gives more than enough for you to eat. In the Old Testament, the prophet Isaiah in chapter 55 refers to it this way, and it's a beautiful passage that I want to kind of finish up with today. In 55 verse 1 and 2 it says this, "Is anyone thirsty? Come and drink. Even if you have no money, come take your choice of wine or milk, it's all free. Why spend your money on food that does not give you strength? Why pay for food that does you no good? Listen to me and you will eat what is good. You will enjoy the finest food." You see, this is the promise that is found in Jesus. That he says to you, he says to me, he says to each one of us, come and eat. Enjoy the finest of food. It's free. It's a gift from God himself. It's a gift of love. For the crowd that was lost and directionless, they were fed by Jesus. And today, when we are lost and directionless, we can also be fed by him. Amen.